Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our final session of the Fair Housing and Housing Development Series, Roles and Responsibilities for Government Officials. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I'm one of the Education Outreach Coordinators at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. Uh, Today, I am joined again by the great Alan Lazo, who has been our lead presenter during this series. I'm also excited to welcome Mandy Gray Wall from Pittsfield Charter Township, just outside of Ann Arbor. Alan is the former executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. He has been a longtime community advocate for civil rights and is currently serving on Oregon's Land Conservation and Development Committee. He is also working with Oregon's Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. Alan has done a phenomenal job with this series, and I'm excited for today's presentation and discussion. Just a reminder, the recordings for this series are available on our website. Mandy has been serving as the supervisor of Pittsfield Charter Township since 2008. She is committed to giving back to her community by implementing a master plan vision that is committed to celebrating community by promoting agriculture, open space preservation, public gathering spaces, multimodal transportation, historic and cultural diversity, infill, and mixed-use development. She has been appointed by Governor Whitmer to serve on the Michigan Municipal Services Authority and has served on the Michigan Association of Planning's board since 2022. Prior to being supervisor, Mandy served 2 terms as the Washtenaw County Commissioner representing Pittsfield Township, during which time she was appointed vice chair of the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners and chair of the Washtenaw County Planning Advisory Board. She has also served as a commissioner on the Michigan Women's Commission. She has a PhD in urban planning from the University of Michigan. Mandy is also a graduate of the Michigan State University's Political Leadership Program and a graduate of the Senior Executives in Local Government Program at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So thank you so much for joining us, Mandy. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I have just a few logistical things and reminders to share. First, this is a webinar. We cannot see or hear you. So if you need any assistance, please use the chat. Additionally, please use the Q&A to submit questions. Questions in the chat may not be answered. We will try to answer clarifying questions during the presentation, but we'll definitely have time at the end to address any questions, so please submit them. Mandy and Alan will be having some conversations during this presentation today, so hopefully it will stir up some good questions for you all, and we can submit them. Please also fill out the evaluation that will appear in your browser. We will also provide a link at the end of today. Certificates will be provided only to those who complete the evaluation and attendance verification information. Please allow us a few weeks to get those out to you. For those who are looking for AICPCM credits, we will be sharing the link at the end of this training. We're really thankful to our partners at the Michigan Association of Planning for their support and having this opportunity to have credits available. And lastly, this presentation is being recorded and the link will be sent out after the training. You can also visit our Fair Housing and Housing Development page on our website, which will have the link to this recording, the slides, as well as any resources that we think would be helpful and throughout this series. Well, that is all for housekeeping. Now we'll get on to the important stuff. Please welcome Alan and Mandy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Bree. It's great to see everybody again and to be here for the fourth webinar in our series. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So today, again, this is the fourth session in the series about fair housing and housing development, focused today on the roles and responsibilities for government officials, as Bree said. But I also wanted to take a second and just go back. I know that some folks have been with us all 4 sessions. Some folks may be joining new here. So really wanted to just set some context for where we've been in the series and how we're going to wrap up today in the 4th session here. So in that first session, you know, I'm coming to you from my basement here in Portland, Oregon, out on the West Coast. And so I use this map analogy to talk about, you know, how we might get from one place in our long history in this country and you know, everywhere across the country, including places like Grand Rapids and other places across the state of Michigan, to where we might like to get to with more inclusive, more equitable communities. And really, in that first session, we talked about that historical context that really set the stage for the continuing inequities that we see today in housing. In the second session, we really, when we talked about that history, we know that there is a direct tie to the historical context for land use planning and zoning to the early parts of its use to segregate communities by race. The image we use here was the first zoning code that did that in Baltimore in the early part of the 20th century. We also know that Dr. King and the movement for open housing played a really critical role in helping to end or make illegal housing discrimination. And so in the second session, we talked about the kinds of tools that we might be able to use or that are available to us to address those inequities, including elements of the Fair Housing Act and specifically the work that can be done around affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, particularly as we're looking at planning and zoning and how we are bringing forward equitable community development in our communities across the country. Again, affirmatively furthering fair housing calls on communities to be proactive in the programs and activities that they are doing around housing and community development, to recognize who might lack access to opportunity, to promote racial integration and reduce segregation in communities, and transform those areas of your community that might be racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. And conversely, really to look at, are there areas of concentrated wealth in your community that might indicate the need to more equitably development communities. In the third session, then we talked about the specific areas that practitioners, particularly land use and planning professionals, might be able to examine or consider as they are looking to implement more equitable planning and community development practices. We know that there are ties, as we said, to lots of areas of land use, zoning, and planning that tie to the work that we do in fair housing, and we can begin to create this relationship between planning, housing, land use, zoning, and the work that is done in the fair housing movement. So we kind of had a menu, a list of areas that can be considered. Certainly, it's not all inclusive, but it also recognized that it's not just the housing context, but there are also lots of other areas external to planning that really need to be considered when we're talking about equitable community development, including other departments in your jurisdiction. We know that there are ties to transportation, permitting processes, building codes, funding and financing elements that come into play as we are talking about equitable community development. And then certainly outside of the jurisdiction, we really need to consider those other elements that help us move forward towards more inclusive communities here. And so that really, helped us think about the resources that are available to practitioners out there and others who are really helping to want to move this movement forward. And so that brings us today to session 4 and really talking about this focus on how all of these elements, from the historical elements to the tools that we have, to the practitioners that are working on this, how those elements might come together in a real world example. We're going to talk with Mandy about what's going on in the township there. But it also recognizes that elected officials, policymakers, and other decision makers play this key role in working to create inclusive communities. We know that those folks are the gatekeepers to the last part of moving the elements that we want across the finish line to create those communities. But it also recognizes that, as our series has highlighted, that each of us plays a role in that work, building that history, the knowledge, and really the political will that we need to create the communities that we all desire and in which everyone can thrive. And as we noted when we talked about tools, the fair housing laws and concepts in our movement around fair housing are a critical resource in working toward those inclusive communities, whether that's through enforcement and holding bad actors accountable for housing discrimination, or recognizing the right that everyone has to enjoy housing that is accessible for them, or helping to promote the proactive vision of communities for all. So again, this session really will focus on how do we bring all of those elements together in a real world example. And I'm so delighted to have Mandy join us today and talk about what's happening in the township, and then enter into a conversation in more detail about the work that she has done there and in other places. So with that, Mandy, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, and have Bree will share your slides also. I'll pass it over to you, Mandy.
I'm so sorry about that. I was trying to mute myself for a bit, so
No problem.
patience, and I apologize for that. And thank you for sort of that review of the work that you've done in the previous sessions. And I love how it's been very holistic, your approach, which is sort of where my comments really come in too. Like was mentioned, I've been the supervisor at Pittsfield Township since 2008. And if those of you that were around at the time will recall, it was the throes of the Deep Recession. And so when I became supervisor, I really sort of looked at the fact that Pittsfield Township, which is a suburban community in Southeast Michigan, sort of has developed as a sprawled out suburban neighborhood, primarily due to the development pressures coming to it from the north, east, and the west. And we knew that those pressures would return post-recession. It was just a function of what that development would look like. And so I really used the time from 2009 to 2011 to do a lot of planning work with the focus on promoting inclusivity and sustainability in Pittsfield Township. And so we wanted to proactively plan for an interconnected and complex community that looked at housing within, as I mentioned, a holistic sort of framework. So it wasn't just focusing on housing and not looking at the fact that we needed to have low taxes to promote the fact that we wanted to have people from all different walks of life living in our community. We wanted to look at transportation also as a very key factor in making sure that the people that live here could get to schools and jobs and daily amenities. So it was really looking at what kind of housing we wanted in our community and also where it would be built and how it would relate to surrounding land uses. So a culmination of that first planning process, which was around 2 years, really, I think maybe we can move on to the next slide, kind of talks about it a little bit.
And
in
Mandy,
terms,
we can't see you. Sorry about that. I didn't want to interrupt you.
no,
We
that's
can't
totally
hear
fine.
you. It's a black screen right now.
You can't see me, you said?
Yeah.
Huh, that's really strange. My screen is showing the presentation splash.
Might
So I'm
maybe
wondering,
use your camera, flip your camera around maybe. Your camera
I
actually
don't,
got flipped. It's just showing black. We saw a tissue box. We see a tissue box.
oh, I'm so sorry. Oh
No
my
worries.
God.
No
Yeah,
worries. We
now
understand.
can you see me?
Yeah, we see you now. Wonderful. All right. I will move on with my slides. No worries.
I have a cold and the tissue box is sitting right next to me.
No, that's perfect. Take care of yourself.
Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate that. So yes, that's kind of the geographic location of the township, as I mentioned, Southeast Michigan in Washtenaw County. But the next slide kind of talks more about the work that we did around the planning work, really trying to figure out where we wanted to promote the infill, the density. We looked at sort of the arterial corridors that already had built spaces and where they could be densified and also have easy access to multiple modes of transportation, including transit. So that was sort of the whole 2-year process that culminated in us establishing 6 form-based districts that would allow for, as I mentioned, sort of multi unit development for housing, close to commercial and retail, all interconnected and accessible through a robust multimodal transportation network. So that was sort of that big grand vision that we put into place. Then, of course, comes the whole hard work of making sure that you put in all the requisite sort of changes that will support that vision to manifest it. So it's not just about sort of making us all feel good about something. It's following through on it. So obviously, the next step was undertaking the process of redoing our zoning, which was another couple of year process, and it wasn't until 2015 actually. So we ended up doing a complete comprehensive revision of our zoning, and we allowed for reduced lot sizes and setbacks for single family housing, allowing for accessory dwelling units, for co-location of multi-unit next to single family, overall just generally promoting diversity of housing stock. And hand in hand with that, kind of continually. So these are never sort of one-time changes. I want to sort of make that point, because even just 5 years ago, we had a situation where some of our affordable housing units that had been built in the 90s hit the sunset clause because they had used affordable credit units from the state to be built. That clause sunset. That was a 25-year clause. The state of Michigan has since repealed that, and there is no sunset. But back when these were built, there was a sunset. So about 5 years ago, they went to market rate housing, because obviously the developers and the folks that have it want to sort of recoup more in terms of rent. And so what the township ended up doing is, when that happened, we didn't want to lose affordable housing units, and we'd have a pilot program in place, which is in lieu of taxes, folks. So as the taxes were being paid, because these apartments were now market rate, we took that additional revenue that was coming to the township and reinvested it back into affordable housing initiatives and programs to make sure that we continue to support affordable housing in the township. So really, those sort of policy decisions, zoning ordinance changes, master plan changes, really sort of very consistently over the last decade and a half have sort of made sure that not just our residents, but the developers and all different stakeholders understand that for Pittsville Township, affordable housing and diversity, inclusivity, sustainability aren't just things that we talk about, but really follow through on. And subsequent to that, it sort of creates this momentum, and we're just going to be finishing up, in fact, later this year, a 200 unit fully affordable housing development on Clark and Gulf side, which is adjacent, interestingly, to the units that went to market rate a few years ago that I just talked about. So I guess my point here is really that the housing crisis, as it's being referred to today, cannot sort of really be studied or looked at in a vacuum, but we really should look at it as a really intrinsic component of a community's identity, and what specific policies and plans the leadership of that community has put into place to make that a reality. And then, as was being mentioned, sort of really looking at it outside of the vacuum of just planning per se, but really also in terms of surrounding jurisdictions. So the more interjurisdictional and regional that approach is, the better it is for the folks that want to live, work in the community. So just to give you an example of what we did in the township, eventually, if you maybe please go to the next slide, Brianna. Here's sort of what the landscape for Pittsville Township looked like back in 2010, sort of your typical sprawled out landscape with berms that separated different land uses. The business parks were here, the shopping strip malls were sort of over here. The McMansions were behind this berm, the apartments were in a different part of the township. If you go to the next slide, you sort of start to see the work that we've done over the last 15 or so years to promote a new form of housing specifically, which is what we're talking about, but land use in general, really retrofitting sort of even those suburban neighborhoods that we had. We cross-connected them with greenways and sidewalks and bike lanes, put in a whole bunch of pedestrian non-motorized amenities with mid-block crossings and bus stops, put a number of apartments and mixed-use housing next to the single families. It starts to create synergies of housing and diversity. And then, like I said, also co-locating the retail and commercial closer to some of these places so folks can walk by to their jobs or to shopping or to the pharmacy and agent place and all that sort of good stuff, which brings to the next slide, which transportation, as I've said many times, is between housing and transportation really are two sides of the same coin in my mind. So you really can't do one without the other. And that just sort of shows some of the work that we've done in retrofitting our main arterials. The photo on my top left right is really how we put in a long sidewalk along with a bike lane over on a bridge by 94, and now we connect straight into the north into the city, and there's a really synergistic sort of, so folks don't really care if they live in Pittsfield Township or Ann Arbor or Ypsilanti. Like, they just want to be able to walk and bike to their job or to their friend's house or to the park or etc. So that's kind of really been the goal over here, is to interconnect not just the spaces within the township but also with surrounding jurisdictions as well. And so that kind of shows a little bit of the work that we've done in retrofitting our transportation network to allow for the integration and accessibility, because you could live here, but if you're using so much of your money for housing and you can cut back on transportation, that makes your housing more affordable as well. And you can live here so that you can take the bus and go into work, etc. The next couple of slides, of course, I'm a planner, I have to have maps. So that sort of really shows you a little bit in terms of what the non-motorized network looked like in 2010. We had some basic sidewalks, really, frankly, that's all the green lines that were. And the change in 24 is not just the sidewalks, but those are 10 feet wide greenways. We put in about 10 plus miles of those. Of course, expanded the sidewalk network, put in a lot of bike lanes as well. Transit is the next slide, actually. The dots are the pedestrian or non-motorized amenities. The transit is now expanded to not just fixed routes, but we've got what's called a flex ride system, which allows for smaller buses to plow the township. And it's app you can download, or you can call on a phone and you can schedule a ride internally and externally as well. So from here to St. Joe's, for example, which is outside of Pittsfield's jurisdiction, but you can have that connection to the Flex Ride, which is through the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. So we're obviously in partnership with them, is how we provide that service. And the last slide really goes back to this whole idea of creating a community. In the last master plan that we adopted in 2022, in December of 22, 2 months before I announced I wasn't running for re-election again, which I'm not, this is my final term, is because I felt like we had sort of really manifested this vision of creating community and preserving Pittsfield Township, and sort of promoting this idea of a sustainable and inclusive community within a framework that allows us to collaborate across political boundaries and be consistent in our approach. Because if the goal really is for many different people from all different walks of life to live here, we have to talk about things outside of just affordable and nothing else. Like, it can't be addictive. It can't be a binary and dictamous conversation. We have to talk about the entire spectrum of what does that housing stock look like. It has to be the 30% sort of affordable, but it also has to be the workforce housing, the missing middle, and also the single family. A lot of folks want to move to the suburbs so they can have a backyard. So we have to really be very inclusive in our approach. And also not just building it, but where are you building it and how is it connected to your surrounding land uses. So, we may begin by increasing the housing supply in the in the coming years, because there's just so much talk about the housing crisis, but we really need to stop and consider, where is this housing being built and what our communities and regions going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Will they be more inclusive and dense so that people from all different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds are neighbors and are sort of connecting with one another on a regular basis, whether it's, you're taking a bus or you're walking the same path every day, or you're going into a shop and you see somebody who's from a different background or a different walk of life. Like, what are those points of connection we're creating from people from all different walks of life on a daily, regular basis? What are our communities going to look like? So that is the vision I think we must strive for towards. If we want to not just build houses and physical structures, but homes and communities.
Thanks so much, Mandy. That was inspiring at least, and I think the perfect place for us to land this fourth session and really get into this more detailed conversation, kind of about the work that you did and how folks can get there. I see that there are a few questions coming up in the Q&A. If folks can put those in the Q&A rather than the chat, that would be helpful for Bree as she's managing those. And we'll turn to the Q&A after we have some conversation with Mandy and I on a few points that really kind of help tie some of this together. And Mandy, one of the things that you said that I really appreciate was this, and as I passed to you and you talked about things being holistic, that also really struck me as being vital. And also, I think what you said about this sense that this work is really about a community's identity. I think is really, really vital too, and particularly when we talk about it from a fair housing perspective, right? It's who do we want to be as a community, and really assessing where we are today or where we might have been in the past, and are we the community that we want to be yet today? So I think those are really critical connection points. But let's go to the kind of the beginning part of that and really talk about, as we said in that first session that we had here, we talked about the history of racial discrimination in housing and how this has shaped inequities in communities across the country, really, really everywhere in our country. How might those elements in that conversation, did that inform the work that you all did and undertook in the Pittsfield Township? And how did that play out there?
100%. That's why I stepped down as county commissioner to run for supervisor, because I felt like we were very well positioned to really retrofit the suburban landscape and promote interconnectivity. So I didn't talk about climate change. I didn't talk about racial segregation. I talked about sustainability and inclusivity. Right. I said, we want to be a welcoming community. What does that really mean to you? And so exactly to your point, the first 2 years were just about that conversation. Who are we and who do we want to be? What is our identity? Today, we're the sprawled out suburban community that, yes, we have some green space here, and it's kind of splotched out. Even the park that I live next to myself, which is a quarter of a mile, I had to get in my car and take my boys there, right? And then this other park, which is even closer to my house, was a private park because it was joining its private neighborhood. So the idea now, today, obviously we're connected through sidewalk and greenway and bike lanes, and the private park is a public park. We worked with the developer and got that donated to the township for $10, and it came with the basketball court and all these different amenities that we have. And we built a small parking lot, but it really is meant to be a neighborhood space for people to come and and use. So I think it really goes back to what I like to say is, what is the DNA of your community? Like, how are you hard coding the DNA of your community? And if you're going to start with the idea that you really truly want to be inclusive and then sustainable, which again, to me, just like housing and transportation are both sort of the same two sides of the same coin. You can't be one without another, is that, you kind of you hard-coded in your starting, in my mind, with your master plan. What is the grand vision for your community, right? And it has to be a collaborative discussion. Like, when we were doing it, this is, again, I take you back to the Great Recession, and the suburbs weren't talking about, transit and pet crossings and all that sort of stuff, and even roundabouts. And so it was not an easy discussion, and people did not want to see mixed use next to them, right? And I put one mixed use node right next to one of the most dense housing that was already in place 20 years ago, right? It had condos and it had single families, and there was this one space that was a perfect place to build apartments and walkability and infill, because the Myers is right across the street, and there was the sea of parking lot, right? I'm like, let's use this and build retail up front, by the main arterial corridor. And there was a lot of pushback. And I remember knocking doors for my second election, and they were like, we hate this and we're going to vote you out. I said, I understand. And I was respectful, and I got it. And I understood that. And I went in knowing that this was a change and people would not like it. And this was 2012, and some of the development hadn't even started. In fact, none of the development actually had started then. And I was okay with being voted out and not being reelected because I felt like my work was what I was doing this because of my vision for this community, and this was it. And I was always very clear about it. And I didn't want to be elected if people didn't want this kind of work. They elected me in 2008. I don't think they kind of understood what I was talking about. But in 2012, I felt like they at least had an idea. It wasn't a contested election, but I still knocked on doors because I wanted to hear from people after the planning process and after the adoption of the master plan, which is a huge change from what we've done before, right? And I wanted to hear from people.
Yeah.
And then in 2016 again, I had a challenge and I changed some of my my team because of retirements, attrition, and all that sort of stuff. And it was continually sort of this idea of, hey, we're going to vote you out. This is too dense. This doesn't work for us. And I was always open to that idea of not serving anymore because I felt like the work was more important than a person, an individual, right? It obviously isn't me that's done it. It's always like you have such great partners and people that come along. Like the first Greenway we built, I couldn't have done it without this one neighborhood that eventually came and championed it with me, right? Because we had so many meetings and so much interaction and dialogue and discussion about why we were doing it, what it would look like, and what this would mean. And really, that was sort of the first spark in my brain that sort of ignited this full network of multimodality in the township. But if we hadn't had that partnership with those residents, it would never have happened.
Yeah, and actually I was gonna follow up and ask you about that. And I do want to come back to this sense, as you talked about in your case, it sort of morphed itself as not reelecting you. But we often see public opposition as a kind of a key factor in some of the movements that we're trying to move forward. So we'll come back to that also. But just what you talked about there, I'm curious about the role. I mean, obviously there's a vision that you and others had for the community, it's how it would develop. But how did the community itself, and you said you were working with some neighbors and residents, and what role did they play in helping develop the vision that eventually came to be there in the township?
Oh, very integral. That's why I had that first slide that says planning processes. I don't know if I want to look at it again. That's why we took 2 years, right? From 2009, 2010. It wasn't until 2011. Actually, it was supposed to be in 2010, but it wasn't until 2011 that we actually adopted the master plan. We did design charrettes and transit tours and walking tours and surveys and all sorts of different input sessions and feedback sessions and all sorts of stuff to get, it has, like I said, it has to start with who do you want to be, and no one person can define that. The community has to define it. The seniors have to be part of it. The young folks, even the ones that don't vote, especially the ones I feel like that don't vote. And I may have been, because at the time my boys were like 2 months and 3 years old and stuff. So I was like, it's their community. We want to, and as a mom, like I want to build a community my kids want to be able to want to live in, right? Because we have so much of our labor force that leaves, our state and our community. So I'm like, we need to retain talent. So it also bleeds into this whole idea of economic growth and development, which I'm talking about tomorrow, place and placemaking, right? It's all interconnected.
Nice. Great. Okay. And you talked about a few different groups that you engage there, and the work that we do in the fair housing movement, the work that we've done out here in Oregon and other places that we talked about in the series, places like California that have implemented specifically, work around affirmatively furthering fair housing. That tool is being incorporated into a lot of planning processes now. We see that kind of movement, in particular with the American Planning Association and other folks like that. For what you know about the fair housing concepts, were those concepts that were incorporated into the work in which you've been involved in, and how have you considered those kind of specific fair housing elements?
Yeah, I think those came very naturally to me just as a planner, and also because I'm a naturalized citizen. I didn't grow up in the United States. I came here as a foreign student, and so for me, going into planning was really tackling these really complex problems. I started off my profession as an economist, and I didn't kind of like all the data in the clean ways. I'm like, we have to talk about and as a naturalized citizen, I feel very strongly about the American dream and contributing to a society and a community and a nation that is diverse and not a melting pot, but really celebrating that diversity and respecting it, right? And sort of folding it into the fabric of our communities. That's where I come from. So for me, all those things were very, very essential, both in my work as a professional, as a planner, but also for my personal experience as a naturalized citizen. I brought all of those to the table, I felt.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and for folks, if you if you have the opportunity to go and look at some of the fair housing resources, one of the protected classes at the federal level is national origin. So folks who might have a perceived national origin that is not from this country. So yeah, appreciate that connection there. But and you know, again, in the vision that you created, what other tools that did you find were effective in working towards building or planning for those more inclusive communities? It sounds like you did a lot of like you said, that kind of 2-year period of creating the vision and really leading with that visioning. Was that the critical tool for you all, or were there other tools that you brought in that really helped move towards making that more inclusive community?
I love that question. So what were the tools? And, as I'm thinking again, I go back to diversity. Yes, it starts, and I've been told that, it starts with the leadership. It starts with me saying, okay, this is the vision, we're going to do this, and including and respecting all different viewpoints. But then we brought in consultants, from the national level to talk about sort of what this means nationally and what they were trying to do, right? In Florida and Wisconsin and in Minneapolis and all these places. And they talked about these examples. So it wasn't just me saying, hey, we should do this, right? So we brought in those guys. Then I recruited my county road commission, frankly, right? And they were like, that was their sort of mojo back then in 2010 and 2009. We build roads and we fix the roads and we add lanes to address traffic congestion. And then I was like, there's road diets and roundabouts, and let's look at CMAQ money, which is congestion mitigation money for, and they allow you. So we did all of these. Let's apply for federal funding to put in a bike lane on this like bridge over 94, right? And so it really is about looking at it very creatively and bringing in all people, right? Again, diversity, like come at it from multiple points of view, because one will satisfy a certain cohort of the resident group and one will satisfy another cohort of the resident group, right? And so really sort of looking at it through multiple perspectives and viewpoints, and then promoting sort of your narrative and framework, as opposed to saying, I think I've done this with you over 2 years and now I think we all know what to do, and then that's it. It has to be continual, right? So it can't be like a one-time thing. And the first roundabout we put in, and I'll say it was a disaster. It wasn't any good. And I'll admit it. It wasn't because they couldn't get the right of way, and the radius is much smaller than it needed to be, a bigger radius to accommodate for the amount of traffic flow, and we messed up. And I was the first one to say, yeah, that doesn't work. We'll never do that again.
Yeah.
So just saying, okay, just transparency, right? Transparency, inclusivity, leadership, consistency, diversity of viewpoints at all levels, all of that stuff. I feel like probably.
It sounds like both internally or externally you worked with the residents, but also internally, I would think, for any township or other types of jurisdictions, in your position, and I think that's one of the critical elements for, a certain level of elected officials or other decision makers, right? There's a more holistic level that those folks might exist at than sometimes that in the different bureaus or departments, right? And so if you can bring that vision up to that level, it seems like that helps in the collaboration some too. Is that what you found as you were doing that work, that unifying elected officials helps with the collaboration?
I think for elected officials, really showing them what makes them look good helps, right? And so, people thought I was nuts to step down as county commissioner to run for supervisor. I mean, it was always retired old men that were supervisors at Pittsfield Township. Nobody had done this job before. Yeah. And so it's just being creative. You can be a volunteer at a nonprofit and think creatively about what your leadership position is and how you want to promote that change. And even if it means that change for one person in 1 year, that's tremendous. I feel like it's excellent work, right? So whatever positions we're put in, just thinking creatively about bringing those values of inclusivity, respect, transparency on a day-to-day basis in whatever you're doing, I feel like really helps. And I have to say, elected officials were probably one of the last ones to come along. I had a great team. I didn't run without a full team on my board. So I have to say that that was already in place, baked in. They knew who I was and what I was doing and when I was doing it. And I was like, I'm bringing you these things, you guys. And they did. They supported me through it all. They couldn't understand some of it sometimes. Even now, they're like, Mandy, what do you do? I'm like, they're like, okay, fine.
Yeah, I
But,
think
the
there's,
rest of it, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead. I don't.
I think there was a couple things that you said there. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I often talk about it. Again, that this sense that we all play a role in some way, and whatever your positionality is. And I like to think of it again as folks thinking about what their particular sphere of influence might be, right? So, whatever you're doing, there's some sphere of influence that you have that you should be taking advantage of or working. And the key is that we're all pushing in the same direction. And so, that's what this series has been about, is to help us get pushing in the same direction in the movement. So yeah, I think that's really critical piece. Again, you've enjoyed some really wonderful success. The stark differences between that 2010 picture and the 2020 is really amazing to me to think about. Again, it's for folks in our movement where we're trying to create more inclusive communities, and the diversity of housing kind of helps that, but just the diversity of land uses, like you said, was really stark. And again, maybe that's not for everybody. Maybe that's not what every community wants to be, but I find it pretty heartening. But that doesn't mean you weren't without challenges along the way, right? So what challenges have you faced in implementing these changes? You've touched on some of them, but I really want to talk about, I mean, what was challenging along the way, externally, internally, and then what work did you do to overcome those challenges?
I think the first one was, so you see the political signs all the time, right? We say elect so and so, the yard signs. They made up yard signs that said Mandy is evil.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is when I was trying to do, some of our work around building greenways in the backyards of neighbors, and I got where they were coming from. So, I think knowing that you will never satisfy 100% of the people 100% of the time, but that you are being responsive to the majority opinion, right? You are really taking into consideration and kind of accommodated and account for. Like when we built our first greenway, did go across some people's backyards, and I went personally. My team went with me, and we went to their homes. We visited them. We said, "What are your concerns? What are you afraid of? What can we do to alleviate those concerns and work with you?" And really building trust and partnership. So I would say that that's sort of been the biggest thing, is really sort of once you do your groundwork and you take your time and you actually show people you're listening to them, right? So the first, I talked about this, in fact, the mixed use note that I put in that people did not want. It was already the most dense housing in the township. It's in the northwest corner of Pittsfield. And they did not want that parcel converted to mixed use. The first proposal that came into the township in 2012, I believe it was somewhere around there, 13 maybe, was to build in, this Myers with other stuff, and people were up in arms and they hated it. And I backed them. I said, I get it. You don't want this in your neighborhood. This is not what the township wants either. That's fine. We're not going to do it. And I went to bat for them with the developers and said, this is not the kind of change we envisioned. You can take me to court. We've been sued. Sure, you get sued and you kind of are like, okay, that's how it goes. And so you kind of just sticking to your principles, to your values, and to what you've written down, right? If you've written it down in a master plan, it's indisputable, it's there, and you have to be able to sort of follow through on it. And I feel like that consistency and approach to principle and being respectful and changing sort of things, which is why we've done a master plan every 3-4 years. Like the first one was a report card. I'm like, let's do a report card. How well have we done on our goals and objectives? What worked? What didn't work? What do we need to change? Transit. We put in a lot more fixed routes, because I wanted more transit in the township. And then we were like, okay, we're paying like, $50 per head for one ride. This is not sustainable. It doesn't work. So we changed it and we came up with a different model. So consistently evaluating, reevaluating, talking, engaging. I did about 2 public meetings a month on average pre-pandemic. A neighborhood has problems with stormwater. Let's bring the Washtenaw County Water Resources people and the township people, and let's all sit down and talk about it. And then we started having a seminar. Now we do a seminar each year for all neighborhoods, right? So just sort of saying, okay, you might have it, but they may not know about it, right? And so just talking about it, and then people are like, oh my God, like we have so much traffic issues in our neighborhoods, and you're going to allow for more traffic over here. Let's talk about how we can mitigate the traffic in here. So that doesn't mean that we don't do this. How can we do things that are mutually beneficial, right? And so really looking outside of binaries and dichotomies and sort of looking at things in a more complex and multiple fashion, right? So there was a development that wanted to happen again. It's in front of a Walmart, and it's sort of, goes with our whole idea of sort of densifying that node, and people, but it had heritage trees, and nobody wants to cut down heritage trees, and I don't want to cut down heritage trees, right? So we did a carbon emission study. So again, just thinking creatively, right? Constantly creativity, inclusivity, respect, transparency, just sort of how do we make these really tough decisions? What is going to work? Not sort of saying I'm pro development or pro, and this is something I've always said that, for especially at the local level, you've sort of heard, hey, you're pro development, you're pro preservation. And I always said, I'm neither. I'm pro community.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I really love that sense, again, not just the commitment to the principles and values, but as you said, you wrote it down on paper, and that was really informed by a community engagement, that 2-year-long process that really helped provide some of that movement forward. So successes certainly aren't without challenges over time, but now that you've kind of gotten that vision implemented, and this is a slightly different question that follow on, what impact do you think it has had on the say the demographics of the population that you've had, particularly the diversity of housing that you've brought in? Did it meet the vision that you had, or what changes have you seen that you think have been really positive for the community?
So I have to give you a personal example for this one. Because the first thing always when people, pose that question to me is, so like I said, I'm came as a foreign student. My mom still is in Delhi. She visits occasionally. And typically she would always come for the election years. It's your election year, I'm going to come and support you and stuff, right? So when she came in 2016 for the 2016 election cycle, she's here for a week, and, she's getting over her jet lag and everything. And then she turns to me and she goes, very nice. I said, what do you mean, Mom, very nice? I said, look, all these, and we just were sitting, and we could see people, like we were in the park, and we could see all different types of people walking. It's so nice, very nice, all because of you. Right? This is my mom, obviously, just. But I think she noticed, right?
Yeah.
She noticed after coming back at the time was after a 4-year period. So there's a change in just the faces of the people that were walking in our community. And my first one was when we started, we built these greenways, and we started seeing people, and back then it was still 2010, people who had this very anti-Muslim rhetoric, and we had people that would just come out and walk, and people knew that they lived in their neighborhoods and they had been in their neighborhood, they just didn't know it, right? And which is the point that I made when I was talking in the beginning of my monologue, is we have to create those points of contact for people, right? Everyday contact. So we put faces to the categories that are kind of perpetuated in the mainstream media and by politicians, and Washington and even Lansing, right? Because that's the power of local, which is why I've always stayed at the local level. And I flirted with the idea one time. People were like, run for state, this, that. Yeah. But it's the power of the local, right? It's not sexy. It's not, oh, you're supervisor. Wow. Right? No, it's nothing, right? But that's okay, because you have the power to implement actual real change in people's day-to-day lives, whether it's who picks up their garbage, or who knocks on their door when they're doing the assessment work, right? I mean, yeah, I think you can change the entire landscape, not just the physical, but cultural landscape of a community, right? Because of the physical. I think you have to start with your spaces and your built environment and how that engages with the people that are living there. And I like to say, where you live is your slice of heaven. Yeah. I don't care. That's a studio apartment or wherever you live, who cares? It's your slice of heaven. And it is our job at the local level, especially to make sure that that is your slice of heaven and it stays that way. And if you're making changes, and I've always said this, if you're going to make changes, you have to enhance and improve on your existing land uses. Your new land uses and your new development can never come at the expense of your existing land uses. And that has to be that has always been a really critical factor in all of the changes we've done around land use and zoning in the township, is to make sure we're enhancing existing land uses. We're making them better, even when people say Mandy is evil and put up a sign and say this is horrible, because now that lady's home value is probably 40-ish% more than it was back in 2009 because of all the changes that we brought into the community, right? And you will have those people that will be very loud and that will come and talk about how horrible this is and how the cross section of the road is so narrow and fire trucks couldn't get through here because it's really meant to be walkable and pedestrian friendly, right? People don't want that sort of stuff. And you have to sort of say, and I did at one point, like, folks, even planning commission approved this one development and my board was pushing back because it was just such a different housing development. Which was really interesting to me. And I said, I love the fact that you live in your suburban homes, and you have your individual private driveways and you have your own garages, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's completely okay. But how wrong is it for you to deny somebody else who may want to live a different lifestyle and not want a private garage and not want to be here? And we want to attract young talent. We talk about it all the time. Where are they going to live? They want a different type of housing style and a different way of living than you and I do. So let's think about that. So if you want to actually attract and retain them, you have to build places where they can and want to live.
Yeah, really, I think a really important aspect of, like you said, of inclusivity, right? It's not, we're not going to exclude the things that folks, we want to include what everybody needs and what everybody wants, right? It's not easy to do. That's a tough balance, and so I appreciate that you've been able to hold that balance. I know there's a lot of questions and other comments. I want to move on to those, so we'll end the questions. But I just want to make a couple of points about what you said. One is, I love your story because, of course, our moms are our greatest fans always, aren't they? And so that's heartwarming. I appreciate that. And also, it's really amazing to me because the work that I'm doing involved in here, in Oregon, we have a really unique land use system that has a statewide land use planning goals and everything. But the point you make, I think, is important, that that hyper local opportunity to make change, and particularly out where you all are, what you've done in your township. I think that's a real model for how folks need to look at how they proceed, right? You can make some real change at that level, right down to the neighbor on neighbor level, like you said. That's the hyper local, right? We can actually change our community by connecting people and creating those connections. So I think super important points that have really added value to the township there. So I really appreciate that, Mandy. So let's turn to a whole bunch of questions here. Bree, do you want to go through the questions and comments and direct some of that?
Yeah,
and I think a lot of it's for Mandy, which is great.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. We did have Mandy. A lot of people are very great. They're very happy to hear from you today. And everyone is very appreciative of your collaborative process, and your point on how transportation and housing are two sides of the same coin. We're getting some very good feedback on that. So we did have some questions roll in though. So one question that came in, for your improvements, did you have to pass a millage to fund them, especially the connecting of different communities with sidewalks and greenways? This person that shared this said they tried to do something similar, but they couldn't get a millage passed for sidewalks and city sewer connections. And so the proposed improvements stalled and never amounted to anything.
Yeah. Again, great question, because you can talk all you want. It's about making it happen. And how do you make it happen? You always need money and resources to make it happen. And money is number one. And as I mentioned, I took my job when it was the Great Recession. There was literally like nose diving, right, in terms of sort of revenues. All localities were, right, and so I kind of really grew up, I like to think, or matured in that time of fiscal constraint. And I knew if I needed to get things done, it had to, again, think creatively outside the box. I was not going to put a millage on because we were all struggling to even kind of make ends meet and all of those sort of things. So I knew from day one, with President Obama at the time, sort of started the recovery money, if you remember. He started to give he had this package too, and it wasn't as big as he wanted it to be, sort of the precursor of what Biden did post-pandemic. And I applied for every single funding source that I could think about. We looked at every local county, started at the county level, county, state, federal, nonprofits, any kind of funding that we could apply for, we applied. And over the last 16 years now, I've got $60 million in grant funding for Pittsville Township. And that's come out of the state of Michigan. I've used CDBG, which is your block grant monies. I've used that to put in rain gardens and sidewalks. They've never done it before. I'm like, can we use it? They looked at the rules. They're like, yeah, you can do it. Fine, let's do it. Right. So just being super, super creative in terms of how to. So I have not raised any millages, no taxes. I have kept my general fund tax rate exactly the same. The only millage we increased was for public safety. Because our police officers, our population has grown significantly. When I started, we were not even 30,000-ish, and we're now close to 40,000. So we need to bring in more police officers, firefighters, that sort of stuff. So we have increased by about $1 million or so. Our park village is also exactly the same, even with the Headley rollback. Even we're at 0.48 still. So have not increased any general fund taxes at all. Just a lot of creative ways to engage partnerships, bring in the road commission. Like I said, we applied for every kind of grant that we could think of, and I bought in a business. I worked a lot with our economic development folks, Spark here. And when we would attract a company, there's money that the state will give you to make to make your roads better and that sort of stuff. I used that to pave one of our roads, and we didn't just obviously pave it, we put greenways and bike lanes and rain gardens and all of that sort of stuff on that. And we were like, fine, let's do it, right? So really the partnerships with your road folks, your county road, I would meet with my county road commission once a month, build those partnerships and relationships. And then they knew I really meant what I was saying. It wasn't just, oh, Mandy wants to build bike lanes. No, it was, why do we want to do it? Where do we want to do it? Where can we get the money? Constantly thinking creatively, putting Spark and the road commission together and saying, hey, you guys partner and go to the state and get this money for the township. And they did. And we got close to, I don't know, 5-6 million. And we paved the road, which was the only primary dirt road at the time in the entire county. And, so yeah, it's just one little step at a time and just thinking very creatively.
That's great. That's wonderful. We did have another question about how you funded it. So there was multiple questions about that. So thank you for answering that.
And just one more thing also, I think also getting really engaged in your community. Like I've worked, so I've been the liaison, worked through SEMCOG, which is Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. In fact, I'm chairing SEMCOG now, which is amazing. But really they have been key too, right? So really defining who are the key players and partners that you want to be engaged, because you have to give back too, right? So it's never a one-way street, right? Creating that two-way street and being available to give to those and being on their boards or whatever they need from you, and then building that partnership, but really making sure you take the time to identify who are the key players in whatever it is that you're doing. It could be a homeowner association group. They can increase their dues and say, in 5 years, we want to do this project. Will you be willing to increase your dues by $10 a year? And that amounts to this much money. And then in 4 years, we can do this work. And that's the piece, is just thinking, being patient and planning for it, because it's not going to happen right away. It takes a lot of time, a lot of years to really make it work. 2 decades in my case.
That's beautiful, and it shows that it also takes time. It takes lots of time. So yeah, with that, how did you implement policies that incentivize the dense housing that you talked about while de-incentivizing gentrification?
Yeah, again, I mean, I really don't have any formula, and that's the whole thing. I think we love to have formulas, like how do we do it, how do we replicate it? And if there is no replication, because you have a unique community, that's the great thing about you, is you have your unique community, understanding and listening, right? So we formed the form-based districts to begin with, right? So we had our mixed-use nodes, and there were 6 of them, and they were geographically dispersed throughout the township, so they weren't concentrated, here, there. Um, and then it was really working consistently with the developers and being willing to say no to them. Like, we said so many no's to so many developments, right? Even though it would have been great to expand your tax base, but it just did not adhere to the vision that the township had at the time. And just, again, finding those partners even within the private sector space and the developers who were willing to continue to work with us. Like, some developers, they did not want to put in mixed use, and then we were like, well, what about if you want to do just housing? Can you do different types of housing? No, we just want to do single family. No, that's a complete no-go. So they had to do multi-unit and single. Even sort of a consent judgment I had to get into, a year or so ago. We continue to push with them. I said, if you want to have an agreement, there has to be diversity of housing stock. It's absolutely non-negotiable. It has to happen. We're not putting just single family. You want to have people from different walks of life living next to each other. What does that look like? It looks like people living in apartments and condominiums and single family. It's fine. And the single family has to be sort of, a smaller footprint as well, instead of sort of sprawled out. So those are sort of the things that we've just said, okay, we've made these policy decisions and that's the direction we're going in, and just sort of always just sticking to it. So we've never created any economic incentive or disincentive. Outside of some of our form-based districts on Washtenaw, we did create some economic incentives and allowed for drive-throughs because it's such a car-centric corridor. So we did those few things there to try to bring in the development, which we've actually not been able to. That's been one of the major fails. We still haven't managed to bring in folks to redevelop that corridor much over there at all. But yeah, you win some and you lose some.
One thing I'd add about when we use the term gentrification is, really, I think that's a vision for what we've seen typically happen in places where, investment comes and then folks are displaced, right? And I think exactly what you're talking about, Mandy, I think what we need to be is intentional about what the vision is that we have, that we can bring investment to places without displacing those existing residents, right? And so what are the levers that you need to pull to make sure that you're doing that, the diversity of housing stock? Because I think that folks, we went through that here in Oregon, in Portland, when we were making investments in housing. People said, well, we need to build all the housing where there's not housing already. And the people who were in the housing already said, no, we want you to build it where we are so that we don't get displaced, right? So making sure you're intentional about what the outcome that you're trying to reach. And folks were very much about, no, we need more housing here so that our community can stay here, right? And so, I think the engagement that you had with communities to see what their vision would be, and I think it's very, very often that vision is, yeah, we just don't want to get displaced, but we would love to see investment come to our community.
And especially if they don't have to pay more, right? Their cost of living should not go up, which is one of the reasons I never touched the millage, right, or the tax base. I'm like, I don't want to make it more expensive for the folks that are living here and build new development on their backs, right? Which is not to say that at some point the tax rate doesn't need to be adjusted. It most likely will at some point, but I felt like we could do without it, and we just needed to retain that preserve Pittsfield.
Thank you. Another question that came in, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit, so and maybe expand on it a little bit. What is the best way you found to communicate the plan and the evaluation / report cards to people in the community?
Communication, I love it. So key, so key and critical. So one of the things I started right off the bat is we revamped our website to make it sort of more of a two-way platform. And again, please excuse me, but I'm talking like, nearly 2 years or 2 decades ago, right? So the website was a huge thing. Like, you had the web page. So it was like the static sort of thing that the county would do for the townships. We were like, this is a gateway to our community. Really started to, so folks could chat with us and really leverage that platform. And also I started a newsletter, which was twice a year, spring edition and a fall edition. And that it encapsulated and started to create really relationships with the residents. It was sized very differently. And I would, if it was my report, it was my way of saying, here's the initiatives that the board approved, and this is what we're doing, this is coming up. And it always had a place where it's like, if you have questions or concerns, here's what's happening with the yard waste, like just small things to big things. Here's what your police folks did, which is really amazing, that somebody got an award or something. We talked about that. If we were going to be doing a planning, here's what's coming up. We actually had a whole section for events that were coming up that we wanted to make sure people put on their calendars. But so we did it in the beginning of the fall. So for October, November, December, whatever was going on. And then around Thanksgiving, we always did recognition events. So I always recognized all the people that served and volunteered on all the different boards and commissions. I also started doing events that were started off as policy wonky things, which I do, but then my team stepped in and they're like, Mandy, you just leave this to us, move away. And they did these amazing events where we bought in, we opened up all our township buildings, all the public buildings. We called it P2P, Passport to Pittsfield. And, we had buses that would go between each of so we worked with AAATA, would donate the buses for the day, and kids would hop on the buses, and we had, our utilities trucks, and they would honk the horns, and kids were there, families were there. One of the kids that grew up going to the event now works in the town. It's just like sort of really created a sense of place and community. We had a harvest festival at our historic district. We would do that every year. We again run buses. We even had trolley one year. People would come, and we brought in our local schools band to play, and just created community. In the end, engaging with people from multiple points, coming at it, the newsletter, the website, the surveys. We continually did so many surveys all the time. The homeowner association meetings, whenever they met, I always went and showed up. Hey, you want me to show up? I'll come, right? And so go to those, creating these events, just sort of think we're here, we're available. Through the pandemic, I started a community letter that I'd sent. First, it was each week because we don't know what's happening. So every week I would send this out. Then it was one, I think I went to twice a month and then once a month or something like that for a whole year. I was continually sending this out to people like, hey, we may not be physically here, but we are here. Like, here's how you get in touch with us. Here's what's happening. Here's who we're working with. Like, continually just staying in touch with your residents and your businesses all the time. I did a survey with Spark on our local businesses post-pandemic saying, hey, how are you guys doing? What's going on? Like, what can we do to help? I think that sort of has to be, again, from multiple different points, continually, all the time.
It's really interesting, Mandy. I really appreciate the perspective that you bring to this, because it's so different than what we see in governments a lot of time. And if folks, out here in Oregon, they hear me say it all the time. But one of the criticisms I have for government folks is that they often show up and tell us what they're doing rather than ask what they should be doing, right? So you spent that 2 years asking folks about what their vision is, rather than planning out the vision and then showing up and say, okay, here's what our vision is, right? So government often just shows up and says, all right, here's what we're doing. What do you think? Right. So I really appreciate this perspective that you're continually engaging with folks to say, hey, what do you need? What should be done in our community? I think that's really, really refreshing.
Go planners.
Yes, this has been really great. We just have a few more minutes left, so I'm gonna have one more question. Let's see. We'll do this one. How do you combat the political will to maintain the status quo?
No. Be willing to have your head chopped off, put your head on the chopping block. Literally, I'm serious. I mean, like I said, I was willing to be voted out anytime. I really was. And I didn't just, I really was. I really wanted, it's what you bring to the table. And really at the end, and I don't know why people don't get it, authenticity matters. And in the country that we live in, like, people just really appreciate you being authentic and true to yourself and not BSing, right? And so I think they got that about me after the first few years. Like, okay, she actually believes in what she's saying and she means it. And if I messed up, which I did all the time, I still do, and we all do, I just apologize and say, I'm sorry. That was, I agree with you. That roundabout, it's not good. It's not good. Let's work with the road commission and see what we can do to fix it. What can we do around it? Like, make it better or different. We put the first mid-block crossing we put in front of a senior center on Carpenter Road. It's one of our affordable senior housing centers, and it's across the street from a Myers, etc. So I wanted to put that in so they could walk over there or get their wheelchairs. So we had what the road commission called like sort of a Z crossing sort of thing where they could come in, and it was in the middle of a busy road. So we wanted to have a space for them so they could wait till this side of the traffic moved and stuff. And then in the winters, the snow would like just didn't work. It was a bad design. It was actually not safe at all. It didn't work. And they came back and we redid it. I said, that doesn't work. Let's redo it again. And we got additional funding to redo it and redid it like 6-7 years later. So continually just being truthful and authentic and not holding on to power. I think at the end of the day, if you start off with the idea that you want political power for the sake of being in a position, which I don't think a lot of, I mean, some maybe, I don't know, I can't speak to it, but I think which is why I'm very partial to being at the local level. I feel like, you're really not in it for the power and glory. Like nobody's going to come up and say, whoa, look at her. She's like, yeah, or maybe I don't know, but it's like, you really can't make it your identity. For me, I never walked into a restaurant. My kids would even sometimes say, hey, mom, you're just I'm like, yeah, I know, but I don't want to be like, I'm just a mom, right? I just walk in a restaurant, sit down, and they're like, and now it doesn't matter to me that I'm not going to be super, because I've always just, been in the background. Like, it's just like, do it for your community. And if you start with that reason, and not for the reason of holding on to the political power. And then I think just showcasing to the rest of my peers as well, right? It is because it brings you that longevity. It brings you sort of this idea that, yeah, we don't like all this stuff you did, Mandy, but you know what? We trust you, so we're going to keep voting for you. So then eventually, like, this is why I announced last year, I was like, I am not running again. And people were even like, can you do a write-in? Can you just run again? Because and that's the second piece of it, is just knowing when you're done, right? I mean, I love this job. I love doing what I did. But I've done what I needed and could do, right? You don't want to be stale. You want to give the next generation of leaders their chance to do whatever needs to happen next. I don't know what that is, but to sort of say, okay, I've done my bit, and just be willing to step aside in a way and, move on.
Yeah, thank you. That was a beautiful way to end this.
Move
Thank
on.
you. Yeah. And, just, thinking about this, I live in a suburb of Grand Rapids, and just everything you're saying, I think could be done in the suburb that I live in. And because it's a very diverse community, and it could be really beautiful. And so I hope that, those folks are on today and really take your words to heart. Because you've really motivated me. I studied a little bit of urban planning, and I'm like, man, this is amazing. Being a planner could be really cool too.
Super cool. That's my passion now. I want to, like, do just what you just said. Yeah, go planning.
So
We
thank you
need more
guys.
planners.
Yeah, thank you so much to both you, Mandy and Alan. This has been a wonderful way to end this series and just provide more information to people on how fair housing can be incorporated into not only housing development, but as you've really spoke to this time, community development. And so we really thank you for your passion and dedication to this and taking your time for being here. We truly, truly appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today, and for any other session in this series. We appreciate your commitment to equity and fair housing and to your community. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the link to the recording and the resources. We'll also be sending out the link for the AICP CM credits in case you missed it in the chat today, as well as the evaluation. And if you're calling in today and need the links, please email us. And lastly, please don't forget to complete the evaluation. And thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.